In 1959, when the PAP government first took office, Dr. Goh Keng Swee was appointed Minister of Finance, and he immediately discovered that the treasury was bare, and he had to implement immediate austerity measures, including pay cuts for civil servants and ministers. It was only by the early 1980s, after 2 decades of nation building, that we had started to accumulate a nest egg of reserves. And at that time, our forefathers considered what to do, because they anticipated that the political pressure to spend these reserves would grow, and that if these hard-earned savings were not properly protected, they could be easily and unwisely spent, and once gone is gone. And they felt that they had to do everything they could to guard against this. So in 1984, at the National Day rally, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew talked about how the reserves could be frittered away by a profligate government spending money that it had not itself earned within a single term. And he proposed a simple principle. If a government wants to spend, it must first raise the money, whether by raising taxes or by making shrewd investments or some other direct, open, proper means, but not by drawing down on the past reserves that it had inherited. And to guard against a rogue government raiding the reserves, Mr. Lee mooted the idea of a president elected directly by the people, who would have the constitutional power and the moral authority to safeguard the reserves and be able to say no if the government wanted to spend it for an unwise purpose. And that was the concept of the second key. 4 years later, 1988, the PAP government published the white paper on the elected president scheme. After the election, in January 1991, we amended the constitution to create the elected presidency. And Mr. Wee Kim Wee, who was then already the president, took on the new custodial powers and became the first president who wielded the second key. Our first priority was to keep the capital sums in the reserve safe. We hadn't thought very deeply about exactly how much of the income to spend. We just took a standard accounting view that the income from the reserves would be the interest and dividends that we earned on our investments. And we call this net investment income, NII. And we decided that government of the day could spend 100% of the NII. Later, when Mr. Ong Teng Cheong was elected president, he questioned this rule. He asked, why do we allow ourselves to spend 100% of NII? He argued correctly that we should also set aside something for the future, because as the years pass, as the economy grows, if your reserve amount remains constant, it gets smaller relative to the economy, and you ought to allow the reserves also to grow. There's no magic rule to this, but we arrived at a split of 50-50. We split the difference between now and the future. And so, in 2001, Parliament passed a constitutional amendment to protect 50% of NII and add that to the reserves. And the other 50%, the government of the day could spend. So 50% for the present, 50% for the future. Over time, we realized that NII may not be the best measure of what you should be able to spend. Because when we invest, we do not just look at income from dividends and interest. We also expect to make capital gains, which are often more important than dividend payouts. For example, if you had bought Facebook shares at their IPO in 2012 at the price of $38 US, yesterday you would have had their value gone up 12 times, because Meta closed at $455 US yesterday. But you would not have received 1 cent of dividends. Meta is about to pay their first dividends next month in March. So in that circumstance, can we say returns from the investment is zero? No, it's wrong. So we decided we should consider not just the interest and dividends, but also include capital gains as well. And of course, you must take into account capital losses as well. And that means spending on the basis of overall investment returns, capital gains and losses, plus in earnings, plus income, interest and dividends, instead of just investment income. We also studied how other institutions which had built up large endowment funds managed them, particularly US Ivy League universities like Yale and Harvard. Harvard has the biggest fund, Yale has quite a big fund, but Yale had a model which was very successful and very respected. We learned how they implemented consistent spending rules, how they smoothened out the draw on funds, because from year to year the fund performance can be volatile. We must understand this. We can project 4% long-term expected returns. Next year, what will you earn? God only knows. It can be plus 10, it can be minus 10. Hopefully after 20 years, it's something like what you projected, but really it's volatile from year to year. And you have to find some intelligent way to smooth it out so that you can spend steadily and not be whiplashed. So we studied them, we modeled our rules on these ideas. So in 2008, we amended the Constitution again to specify that the government would spend out of net investment returns, NIR, instead of net investment income, NII. But we kept the 50% rule, so the government could spend 50% of net investment returns instead of 50% of net investment income. And we call this amount, which a government can draw from the reserves and add to the annual budget to spend, the NIRC, Net Investment Return Contribution. And this is how we arrive at today's system of spending half of investment returns and saving the other half. After decades of refining and improving the system, testing it out, making sure that it worked as intended.